Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Public Library. I'm your host today, Jen, and I'm here with an incredibly accomplished art critic and a fascinating author of a new book about stones. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hello, Jen. Thank you so much for having me. My name's Hettie Judah, and my latest book is called Lapidarium, The Secret Lives of Stones. And it's a slightly sly title because one of the big endeavors with the book is to muddy the waters a little between stones and life forms, to argue that in fact these aren't completely distinct entities, and to remind readers a little bit about how life and stone are interlinked and interwoven and quite often interrelated.
It is such a fascinating book and a beautiful book. Physically, it is absolutely gorgeous. Before we get into it too much, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your career and how it led you to this book.
Sure. Well, so my day job is I have a wonderful day job. I write about art, so I get to spend a lot of time in museums looking at various kinds of collections. And that could be contemporary art, but it's also historic collections of artifacts. And I also get to spend a lot of time talking to artists, and they are wonderful and fascinating people, and they quite often are great readers, and they are very interested in rather esoteric subjects. And I find that they're incredibly sensitive as a group of people to concerns that the rest of the population kind of latches onto maybe 10 or 15 years later. So, we talk about about artists being avant-garde, and we forget what that means, but it really means that they're there ahead of the field, engaged in stuff that we suddenly might all get very kind of excited about 10 or 15 years later. So I've really noticed in the last few years, talking to artists, there's been this growing interest in deep time, in geology, in thinking about the inherent liveliness of what we otherwise think of as lifeless objects. There's also a lot of interest in extractive industries and how that relates to empire and colony, and also to do with expressions of power and ancient art, of course, as well. So all of these different themes and interests really kind of fed through into thinking about stones as a class of object, and I take that as a very loose class of object. So I cover some things that people might even argue are not actually stones, such as coal, and they can give us different ways of looking at the material world.
It is so fascinating and so interdisciplinary. And, one of the things that I thought when I was reading it, right before we started recording, I was mentioning that I studied medieval history. And something that I always think about when I think about the Middle Ages is that when they talk about the Catholic Church, they talk about the church thinking in centuries rather than in days or weeks or months or years. And I think that it's super interesting that like stone kind of invites us to think on an even grander scale of time, and the way that like this really grand epic, if you will, time scale interacts with these very like personal stories about how particular historical figures and cultures have interacted with stone. Just so fascinating. So like how did you walk that line, between like the really wide view and the human scale?
Yes, I mean it's almost like one of those, that fabulous Charles and Ray Eames film Powers of Ten, where you kind of zoom out progressively, because when we talk about these large timescales, there are even kind of increments within that. So I mean, obviously, when we're talking about deep time, we're really thinking in billions of years. And I mean, I'm not a geologist. I write about art. I'm a writer. But I think if you're a true geologist, you need to be temporally bilingual almost. You need to be able to think in these really unthinkable stretches of time, and also to function somehow in the human realm, because as people, we're really only naturally tend to be able to think two generations on either side of ourselves. And that's kind of our grasp of time. But I think it's also really fascinating thinking about stone artifacts as witnesses to the shifts in culture, to the changes in power. And I mean, you as a medievalist will appreciate this an awful lot. One of the things I'm really interested in with stones is how they've provoked us to tell stories. And what I find fascinating is that quite often it's not even natural stone formations that provoke us to tell stories, but it's the stone artifacts of earlier civilizations that were incomprehensible to people hundreds of years ago that provoke people to tell stories. So whether we're looking at stone axe heads that were referred to as thunderstones that the gods were casting down from the heavens, that became a foundation for a belief system about this kind of angry this angry god with the hammer up in the heavens, or flint arrowheads or flint tools that were shot by elves that were kind of mischievous and interfering with your livestock, or something like Stonehenge, which has had so many different iterations in storytelling that there was even this class of people, the ancient order of Druids, that were essentially invented in the late 18th century. This imaginary order that are now thought of as being quite an ancient order that have access to Stonehenge as a ritual site. So there are just these kind of layers on layers of storytelling and mythology that grow up around these artifacts. And for me, really, it started in a way with some extraordinary objects that are found in Istanbul. I lived in Istanbul for 4 years. And there are these 2 Gorgon heads that are in an underground cistern that was created by Justinian in the 6th century. So he was a Christian emperor, and the Gorgon's heads must have come from a much earlier structure. So they were, in Justinian's words, they would have been pagan. So they would have been what we think of as kind of a Greek structure. And so they're almost shoved down underground at the base of these columns in an underground cistern, as if they were trying to kind of squish them from being removed and used as kind of powerful talismans again. And I love the fact that they are these witnesses to the turn of power from, in quotes, the kind of the pagan civilization that lived there before to the Christian civilization, and all of their history has really been lost to us, and yet we can still see that these are objects of tremendous power, and that even the Christian emperor was slightly nervous about them and wanted to put them somewhere out of sight with an entire structure basically balanced on their heads so that they couldn't bounce up and become active powerful objects again.
That is so fascinating, and I believe that is one of the opening anecdote of the book, right? And I've been fascinated with those cisterns for a long time. And I think it's a really beautiful, like both metaphor and literalization of the way that medieval culture kind of remixed ancient culture in a lot of ways. And I just love that way in which, like, these stone witnesses, as you called them, invite later generations to sort of reimagine their own past and tell their own stories, as you were mentioning. I'd love to talk a little bit about the interdisciplinarity, because as you've already mentioned, you talk about art and myth and geology and philosophy and religion and all these things. And so how did that interdisciplinary view affect your research? Like, what type of sources were you looking at? And how did you determine your source base with such a expansive view?
So, I mean, I really started off, I've got, I guess, about 2 meters of books that were kind of like my base text that I read just as a kind of starting point. And really from there, I was looking just almost for the little germs of what might be interesting stories. And then from there, quite often I was looking at kind of PhD theses and academic papers. And I really did end up reading some quite obscure papers. So I read one about equine dentistry and archaeology, which turns out to be fascinating because you're looking at how people on the Eurasian steppe, whether they were bridling their horses, whether they were already riding horses, or whether they were wearing them, using them in a harness. So it became quite kind of wide moving. And then also it's really funny because I think funny is actually the wrong word, but it's very interesting. So I'm a writer and I'm somebody that privileges text, there's no question. But one of the things that I really wanted to make sure that I did in this book is not just make it a kind of an Enlightenment style book that was looking just at kind of Western systems of knowledge, which then meant that I needed to look at oral traditions as well. And so I ended up also looking at or listening to various recordings as well, because if you're just looking to texts and things that have already been written, quite often there's going to be a whole class of knowledge that's or many classes of knowledge that are missing from that. So it was it was quite an interesting moment for me to realize what I was not seeing and not hearing and unaware of, because I privileged text and because I privileged written sources.
That is so fascinating to me. And, it did occur to me as I was reading that, you do take a very global view, as you say, but each stone in and of itself, or most of them anyway, sort of have global stories, because they're often traded over long distances or won in conquest in international wars. And I'm wondering, like, how did the global view influence how you structured the book? Because it really is sort of like a collection of essays. And so I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about how you landed on that structure, as well as your groupings of how you group the stones within the text?
Sure. So I mean, I think one thing that became really evident very early on is how actually the stones also could tell a story about how interconnected the world has been for such a long time. I mean, we're talking about trading networks that go back thousands of years, and it's really astonishing, because these are very durable objects, to really to look at how they've moved around the world. And in particular, I think there's one artifact that I look at, which is not, it's not one of the oldest objects, but it's a little amulet in the shape of a salamander, which has got rubies down its back, and it was worn by one of the sailors, that was one of the noblemen who was going into the who was on the Spanish Armada, and he was sailing up, towards to invade Britain. And what was just extraordinary was the fact that the shape of this amulet relates to artifacts from Central America, but the rubies came all the way from Burma. And you've just got this extraordinary vision of the scope of Spanish power at that moment. I mean, it's 500 years ago. It's extraordinary to think about that stretch and the cultural exchanges that are going on that long ago. I mean, there are records of conversations happening between Venetian gem dealers and people in the kingdom of Pegu in Burma, around whether they should be worried about the Spanish coming to invade them. And so, I mean, as I say, these stones are quite often witnesses to extraordinary things. And even something like Stonehenge, I mean, the distance those stones traveled, actually, from a stone's perspective, is quite long, when you're talking about moving things without technology. So that global aspect felt very necessary. I'm also very lucky. I'm quite widely traveled. I've been, I guess as far east as Korea. From my perspective, I'm sitting here talking in London, and I've been lucky enough to spend quite a bit of time in Mexico at the Extraordinary Anthropology Museum when I was researching an earlier book, and I do get to spend a lot of my time in museums and historic sites. So I get to see all of these extraordinary artifacts and get a sense of, of all of these conversations going on between cultures, and of the way that these artifacts do travel around and change hands. And good stone never goes to waste. So if you're going to conquer somewhere, you're not just going to chuck this stuff out, you'll reuse it. So you find these even carved piece of stone or marble getting plundered or reused in buildings, and they have this ongoing life. It's extraordinary.
It really is. And it's really interesting to me how, when you get into the history of these stones and the sort of cultural stories and meanings that have attached themselves to them, stones sort of come across as, very natural, as products of the natural world, but also very supernatural, imbued with all of these abilities and healing powers or magical abilities. And they're also very material, yet very loaded with like symbolic meaning too. Did you find yourself encountering stone in places that you didn't expect? Like, for instance, when I studied medicine, I did not expect to find stones there.
But it's this funny thing. I mean, it's once your eyes are open to this stuff, suddenly it's everywhere, and you start to really think of things in a very different way. I think one thing that for me really kind of flipped things and blew my mind was when I was thinking about stone pigments in painting. And I was particular, there's one story that's about cinnabar, which is looking at a particular Indian painting tradition called Pitchvi. And it's based on really kind of ancient Eastern alchemical traditions. And the stones, the paints used for Pitchvi are all hand ground from raw mineral sources And the process of purification is in itself a very ritual procedure. So it will take really like a month to grind each mineral down and purify it to the point where it can be used as paint. And it's really, it's stored in little tiny pouches, like as if it was kind of, you know, pearls or something, in very, very fine powder, and then thinned with gum arabic and painted. You know, they use a kind of a shell as the kind of palette. And once you start to think about a painting as being all of these layers of powdered mineral pigment that are then burnished, you know, with a piece of quartz and then layered up again and again, and you start to actually think about them as thinly layered stone, it's quite extraordinary, because that's essentially what it is. This painting is made of very, very thinly layered stone. So I mean, and you know, you start to really see how completely entwined it is with everything. I mean, even, you know, even our most contemporary sophisticated electronics are powered by rare earth minerals that at some point have been chipped out of an underground rock face.
Yeah, one of the things that I love that you talk about, I mean, I guess the theme of the entire book is the way that stone has shaped human development, and also the way that humans and their culture have shaped stone. And that links up to something I think interesting that you were talking about earlier, about like how stone has sort of like written itself on human bodies, like with the story that you told. And I think of also the you know, the nuns who were medieval illuminators who had lapis lazuli on their teeth in their skeletons, because they would wet their paintbrushes with their mouth and then continue painting, you know, and that would show up in their skeletons. And, you know, I just think it's so interesting the way in which, you know, taking this view really encourages you to sort of like question that line, even between like what is environment and what is human, what is civilization, what is natural, you know.
That's amazing. I'd never heard that story before. That's absolutely extraordinary. And what's amazing about, so if you're talking about the the nuns doing this illumination, if they were using lapis lazuli, so that's ultramarine, which means from the other side of the ocean, and that lapis lazuli came from the same mines in Badakhshan that that were used by, you know, the Mesopotamians. So this is the same source that was used continuously over thousands of years. I mean, it's just, which again, when you talk about the globalization, the global aspect of it, I think it's kind of mind blowing that you know, there is such a huge, distant and global trade in all of this material. In terms of the kind of human impact on stone, I mean, I think you know, there's this old convention of, you know, stones being this stable thing, something that's going to be there forever. But of course, we're having a huge impact on the stony world. I mean, in the coal story, I talk about mountaintop removal, which is a very brutal form of coal mining. That's, well, as far as I know, it's still being carried out in the Appalachian Mountains. And it's basically exactly as it sounds. So people drill into a mountain and they send dynamite down until, rather than having to dig down into the mountain top has been removed to the point where you expose the coal stream. It's gobsmackingly destructive. So everything beneath the you know, the cone of the mountain, all of the top of the mountain is basically sent down into the valleys below. So it kills everything. It kills the water sources. It kills, you know, all floral, faunal, and most fungal life, I imagine. And it's a vast amount of land that's been destroyed like this. So I mean, there are of course these enormous extractive industries that yeah, that keep going, and there are also extractive industries that we don't even think of. The largest extractive industry at the moment is sand and gravel. So 50 billion tons of sand and gravel are extracted annually, which is so much more in quantity. It's so huge by comparison to the next largest, which is I think iron ore. It's about 2.5 billion tons each year. So I mean, just literally gravel being mined is, you know, it's shifting, it's creating huge holes in the earth and moving it around. But just also in terms of when we think of our fossil record and the impact that human technology and human intervention has had, it's not simply in digging holes, it's in creating, you know, essentially novel minerals. I mean, we can think of concrete as a novel mineral substance. So all these things like concrete and plastic, they're going to be part of our, you know, the kind of fossil footprint of our era. And I think, I mean, there was this fantastic term, mineral evolution, that was coined about 15 years ago by Robert Hazen and a team of scientists working with him. And his team have identified, I think, 208 new minerals that have developed naturally due to human intervention. And of course, then on top of that, then there are hundreds of other kind of novel mineral type substances. So right now we're having an enormous impact on the stone world in many different ways.
That is so interesting. And I think it's a really good point that, it's not only interesting to take this long view of time, but pretty urgent to our survival in the long term. And I think that's a really powerful message that accompanies this book, that like kind of decentering the human, like in this case, kind of can help us actually preserve ourselves long term. I love this book so much. Thank you for coming to talk to us. Are you working on anything else right now? Are you researching any new projects?
Well, I've always got quite a few projects on the go, but Jen, there's one really exciting thing that I have to tell you, which I've just heard confirmation that I'm going to do a children's version of Lapidarium. And there's a really fabulous illustrator on board for it. I think it's going to be a really gorgeous book, and that should be, well, I know it's being published in the UK in fall 2025 because it's got to be very fully illustrated. So I've got to write that by the end of November. Currently, I'm working on a book and exhibition called On Art and Motherhood, which should be coming out in 2024. So I'm being kept out of trouble. I've definitely got my hands full.
Excellent. Does that second project you mentioned, does that link up to your work with, oh my gosh, I'm going to probably get the word order wrong, but the art parent, oh gosh, I'm so
The
sorry.
Art Working Parents Alliance.
I'm sorry.
The Art Working Parents Alliance really came out of a lot of research that I've been doing actually on the impact of motherhood on artists' careers. So I had a book that came out in January of this year called How Not to Exclude Artists, Mothers and Other Parents. And while I was working on that, I was contacted by quite a few people working in the arts in different ways, whether they were academics, curators, museum staff, people working in the commercial sector, really talking about how they'd kind of suffered very bad treatment as parents within that sector and how poorly adapted the sector was to their needs as caregivers. So that's what the Art Working Parents Alliance is about. Unfortunately, that is just a UK-based network, though anybody in the US is absolutely welcome to start an American version. Yeah, but so it is somewhat connected to it. But there'll be a big touring exhibition with Hayward Touring in the UK called On Art and Motherhood that should come out it starts in March next year. So that will come out about the same time as the book.
Oh, excellent. Well, that sounds fascinating. And, I hope that perhaps in a couple of years, you might consider coming back to talk about the children's version of Lapidarium, because I would love to know, what it takes to convert something this big and complex for a child's perspective. That sounds absolutely fascinating.
I'd love that. Thank you so much. And thank you for your support and for reading and all you do as librarians. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, listeners, please check out Lapidarium. I loved this book. It's out in the US now, so you can pick it up at your favorite independent bookstore or library, wherever you get your books. Thanks for joining us, and it is time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.